Hello all, and welcome to Qserve podcast on the MDR Deadline Countdown. My name is Gert Bos, CSO at Qserve, and I will be your host. This podcast series contains 5 episodes where we will guide you towards the implementation of the MDR. But because many of you requested, we will launch additional special episodes. So you are currently implementing the MDR, or are you just really curious about the process? Then follow our podcast channel called Qserve Talks and get ready for all the insights from an interdisciplinary group of experts. In our last episode, together with Giovanni, we discussed what we learned from the MDR so far. Today, we will address the topic sufficient clinical data, with a particular focus on legacy products. Joining me is Giovanni Di Rienzo, Qserve's EU MDR lead. Before joining Qserve, he worked at 2 major notified bodies, TV Zuid and BSI, as well as in the medical industry. Welcome, Gio.
Hi, Gert. Thanks for having me again.
My pleasure. Today with us as well is Wiebe Postma, and Wiebe is the Qserve CRO lead. And before Qserve, he obtained his Ph.D. in molecular biology and worked at a large orthopedic manufacturer. Welcome, Wiebe.
Hi, thanks, Gert. Good to be here.
So every episode, I would like to kick off with one general question. This time, I would like to ask you, Wiebe, what is your favorite medical device and why?
Yeah, so I actually started my career in medical devices with a company that makes intraocular lenses. And at that time, really, I fell in love with the ophthalmology field. And whenever I still get to work on intraocular lenses, that makes me the happiest. So I guess that's the answer. Intraocular lenses.
IOLs. I didn't know. So let's get started on the MDD legacy product debate we'll have today. So let's start with a broader question on the applicability of the MDR to legacy products, relevant to our debate on clinical data. And perhaps best addressed first to Giovanni. So Gio, we see in daily practice that from the side of notified bodies, but sometimes also within corporate interpretations, more and more elements of the MDR that are not specifically mentioned in Article 120.3 on the applicable parts of the MDR during the grace periods are being addressed. A number of these are generated from the concept of the applicability of PMS. Could you explain what in your interpretation is clear and what is less defined?
You're right. Article 123 looks short and simple, but is not as straightforward as it appears at the first sight. The requirements that will apply from May to all devices are those related to market surveillance, and this is not something that heavily impacts on manufacturers. It's not something that requires a major implementation effort. Then there are those related to vigilance, and for once, I believe here the situation is quite clear without major gray areas. And finally, those related to PMS and registration of device and economic operator. And here is where the tricky part is. For example, all economic operators also have PMS responsibility. So the additional requirements for them is not only linked to the registration in UDAMED, but it's much wider. And it's not immediately clear if you read Article 120. So it's likely that all contract with the players in your supply chain will have to be updated from May this year, which can typically require a significant effort. It's not something you do overnight. Also, and probably this is something that Wiebe can expand on, it's important to note regarding PMCF that the expectation is not only to have a PMCF plan in place in May 2021, May this year, but the expectation is to have the plan in actual execution for legacy devices. It's not written explicitly in the regulation, but it seems to be the notified body's expectation, which is also in some way echoed in the MDCG guidance on sufficient clinical evidence for medical devices.
Great insight, Gio. Thank you. And Wiebe, as you are called out by Giovanni, how do you perceive this from a clinical perspective?
Yeah, so PMS includes PMCF. And so I believe that manufacturers should also have an MDR-compliant PMCF plan, even for legacy devices, for MDD CE-marked devices, that they may not even transition to MDR. From 26 May on, they require a MDR-compliant PMCF plan. So if you have devices that you are going to CE mark under the MDR, this is a good time to still collect additional clinical data if you need it. But for devices that are using the grace period and not transitioning to the MDR, you must still comply to the PMCF requirements. So at minimum, have an MDR compliant procedure in place and have a PMCF plan in place. And this seems a bit over the top maybe, but files of MDD devices in the grace period may still be sampled during notified body audits. And we have seen notified bodies suspending CE certificates of MDD devices that do not have sufficient clinical evidence and do not have an adequate PMCF plan in place. So that can still happen after 26 May.
That's an interesting thought. Let's continue, Wiebe, on that path and dive deeper into the lessons that you've learned on the new concept of sufficient clinical data. It seems to determine what is enough, but it does not. It only appears to make it harder to reach the evidence needed, as the data should be sufficient in quantity and quality. What have you so far learned from the various interpretations that are circulating on this concept?
So it's about a quantity and quality. And in the past, you or some manufacturers could get away with lots of low quality data, like sources using expert opinions, a collection of cases, and investigator-initiated studies. But I think this is becoming more difficult under the MDR. Notified body reviewers now focus much more on the quality aspect. And in many cases, when there's no GCP compliant data, the manufacturers have to conduct additional data collection. And for other data collection methods that are not studies, it will be important to demonstrate that it is a high quality data collection. So this means you need to keep adequate documentation, work according to a plan, have a report at the end, document the qualifications of research sites or investigators, and very important to have a statistical justification and a rationale for the appropriateness of the method. And the challenge remains to know what is sufficient, when is it enough? Everybody has that question. And that is device specific, and it can only be answered with experience. What helps is review by clinicians and other experts and the buy-in of your notified body.
So a lot of debates and a lot of people working on this together, and then challenge the notified body to accept what all these experts have been bringing. Let's move to Giovanni. A quick question for you. Do you anticipate we will receive further guidance on this topic in the near or maybe even distant future?
Well, we would certainly need some guidance there, but to be honest, the short and blunt answer is no. We will very likely have to live with the tools we have now. So the tools we have are essentially MedDev 2.7-1, which ironically, it's a guidance that is not even directly applicable to MDR. And the other tools is the other guidance, MDCG 2020-6, the guidance for legacy devices. As far as I know, neither the Commission nor the member states have anything planned in this area for publication. I would be very open for a nice surprise, but at the moment, I'm not holding my breath in this area. And to be honest, I don't have much hope for notified bodies either to try and enter this minefield. They struggle with this concept of sufficient clinical evidence, like all of us, like anybody else. So why should they stick their nose out just to get maybe told off by their competent authority or by the Commission? The only real hope we could have is maybe with common specifications. Common specification could help defining what is sufficient for certain specific devices, for example. But based on how fast those common specifications have been published so far, I would say this is probably something we can discuss after 2024 or around that time.
So we have to be very patient and on our way then, in essence, Wiebe, without any further guidance besides the few MDCG documents that have been posted so far. So in that sense, perhaps the best we can do is to look around for best practices in how to set the goal, how to define what is good enough, and then to determine the best way to collect further data as needed. That will be acceptable to the notified body in all aspects.
The way I see it is that the MDR requires us to raise the bar for clinical evidence. That is clear. But what it will look like exactly is still fluid, and it will ultimately be determined by the notified bodies and the industry in the coming years. So it's going to be some combination, I believe, of what is reasonable and what is feasible, and what others are doing and how the notified bodies and competent authorities are receiving it. And look at it as a new state of the art. I would recommend to keep a close eye on what other manufacturers in your product area are doing. But that being said, I also firmly believe that within each manufacturer's organization, there are always people who know exactly where the clinical gaps are and where the shoe pinches. And I think we should listen to those people and do the right thing to guarantee that devices are safe and perform as intended.
So following the heart and the instinct of people that know actually what's going around, that's an interesting thing, because that is maybe not objective, but that is easy to do in a way. So if we follow up on that, what would be your advice to manufacturers that have attempted, for example, justifications no PMCF is needed, or selected data collection tools to the notified body that the notified body then deems to be too superficial in nature for the underlying query?
Well, a lot of time is often lost trying to rationalize your way out of clinical data collection. And I do understand and even recommend to try and aim low at first, but make sure that you have a backup plan and be ready to bite the bullet and start the necessary PMCF activity. You have to keep in mind that any clinical operation, whether it's a clinical study, a survey, or a registry, usually takes more time than anticipated. And one thing that you do not want to do is run out of time. So I would recommend to have backup plans with generous timelines. And if there's too much discussion, maybe make the investment and collect those data. Clinical evidence requirements are only going to go up and not down. So it definitely makes sense to avoid the bare minimum. And also, as evidence-based medicine becomes more important, having strong clinical data can give you a competitive advantage over other manufacturers. So keep that in mind.
I certainly will, because that's positive thinking, and I always like positive thinking. What can we do instead of what can we not do? Gio, is there anything, if you look back at your decade of working between the two largest notified bodies, is there anything you can add to this subject?
Well, all I can say is that we all have to face the reality that notified bodies are no longer what they used to be, say, 10 years ago. They don't operate the same way. And that's for a number of reasons. In my opinion, some good and some not very good, but that's probably something out of scope for this conversation. Notified bodies now apply the rules often quite strictly and without shades of gray. They are not necessarily buying into a, let's call it, common sense approach, if that approach doesn't fit very well within the rules. And to be fair, I don't think we can really blame them for doing that. That's their role. As Wiebe said, the reality is not going to change. It's just going to get worse with clinical requirements continuously going up. So all I can suggest is to start collecting data as soon as possible. Look for the most appropriate, look for the most efficient way of doing it, but start doing it before it is too late. And on the other side, on the regulator side, the notified bodies and competent authorities and commission, they will all have to accept that the transition as it is now is very difficult to manage. I don't want to say impossible to manage, but that's probably what I'm thinking. We have seen from the commission survey that was published by Team NB the enormous workload that notified bodies are expected to handle in the next 2-3 years. And well, if you have seen that, probably we don't need to comment anymore. You have a feeling of how things are going. So all the regulators will have to face this reality and try to find a workable balance between patient safety and access to devices. I think it's clear and it's reasonable that moving forward, the medtech industry will need to change pace, change mindset, become closer to a pharma world type of mindset. But the transition as it is and the retrospective application, it's at the moment not entirely reasonable.
That's great additional insight. I do agree also after having worked in notified bodies for 15 years. I remember one colleague who used to say that animals are strange creatures, the notified body. But I believe that they have been adjusting rather rapidly. So that's true. And we have to adjust now as well. Industry has to adjust, as you rightfully say. There's no way back and looking at how it should be, but there's only the positive hopes of doing things better, more structured, and hopefully we'll get enough time to move through this rough period. Well, unfortunately, we have come to an end of our second episode. I hope that you both had fun, Wiebe and Gio.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you both. And I hope that you listeners at home have also gained some great insight. For now, I would like to wish you all a lovely week and hope to talk to you in our next episode, which is one of these special editions with Eric Vollenbrecht from Axon Lawyers. We will be discussing legal issues in regard to the MDR. So keep an eye out on our website or social media, and I will talk to you soon.